So now we come to the panel discussion. We hand the. So, Boris will take over. The floor is yours.
So before you go out on the streets, I would like to ask our panelists, Erin, Nermin, Javier. He's leaving.
He's at the bar.
He's going to the bar. And Denis, up on stage. Okay, I forgot to click. What you can see here is our website that's going to grow over the next years. I'm sorry. And I'm very, very happy to have our four panelists for a discussion of, I guess, about an hour. We have until 10 o'clock. So we prepared 3 questions for all of them, and I hope that we have time for a short discussion with the audience afterwards. And instead of me introducing the 4 panelists, we asked them to introduce themselves, not just by talking about themselves, but by talking about themselves through their maps. And I would like to start with this map. And
hello everyone, my name is Nermin. I'm originally from Cairo, currently not living there, but I'm from Cairo. For the past 5 years I've been engaged with maps, mapping projects, etc. I started because I'm originally an architect. I had to deal with a lot of maps, especially when it comes to heritage management and looking at the official state maps and how do they define borders, boundaries, neighborhoods, where do they start and where do they end. And this made me question what other possible maps would be. And then I started to be engaged with alternative learning initiatives in Egypt. One of them was the History Workshops of Egypt, which basically does, in a similar way to the History Workshops of Britain, like social history or bottom-up history. It works with collecting personal narratives about the past. And we worked on this map in Port Said, with a group of 20 participants. They were researchers, people with interest in the history of the city that has lived 3 wars and encountered a lot of traumas, scars, and unspoken about moments. We collected personal statements and testimonies from people who lived during the civil resistance movement, newspapers, photo and family archives, even songs that have been sung during the war periods. And we tried to map them, as you see here, but we tried also to subvert all the logics of the map. So for the extent, for example, and since we're speaking of stories, we couldn't really look at Port Said alone. We had also to work on Egypt and to even extend it to the bigger, wide world. When we found in the archive of 2 Australian girls who moved to Port Said before the World War to search for their sister who also lived in somewhere in Germany, etc. And we also had to play with the legend of what is being mapped. So instead of having borders, we had personal stories. Instead of having the legend itself represented the personal narratives, the family archives, the cultural migration of ideas, the movement of commodities within the city, all taken from the people we have spoken to.
Hey, my name's Erin, and I'm part of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which is a data visualization and, I guess, counter-cartography and digital storytelling collective that we founded in the San Francisco Bay Area, but that now also lives in New York City and Los Angeles, so all in the US. And we started kind of in the height of what is now being called the tech boom 2.0, or the second dot-com boom, when a lot of Silicon Valley tech companies have been basically creating contexts of gentrification and eviction. And so we formed our collective basically in order to figure out who was being evicted, who the evictors were, and to provide tools and resources for housing activists that were fighting to stay put and to stay in their homes in the Bay Area. And I never had heard of counter-cartography when we started our project. I had never even taken a class in GIS or anything. But we were all like housing activists that really just wanted to produce some resources that could be useful for the sort of on-the-ground movements. Since then, the collective has grown a lot, and we have produced quite a lot of work. And really for us, like the end goal has been all along to become like obsolete. Like we just don't want to have a function anymore. We want to be able to create the tools and resources so that we can win these fights. But that's also, I know, utopic. So I think until we stop gentrification and displacement in the Bay Area, we'll keep on producing maps. And like I said, also in New York and Los Angeles. Yeah, I don't know. What else should I say?
Thank you very much.
Is that good? Okay.
That's perfect. And let's see, Denis.
So this is a very important map. I've been making maps for a long time, and I found myself, I'm a geographer, and I got hired in a landscape architecture department. And I had to teach studios, it turned out. My second semester, I had to teach a studio in landscape architecture. I knew nothing about landscape architecture. But I knew something about making maps, and I thought landscape architects need to know something about making maps. And they need to know something about their world. And as a geographer, I thought, we can do these things. So we started going around mapping local neighborhoods. And each semester, we'd go to a different neighborhood. We came back to this one a lot, because I lived there. In fact, I sort of live in the middle of that image. After we'd been doing this for like 6 years, I co-taught a studio with a guy named Robin Moore. And we decided, instead of just having the studio make these maps, we would reproduce these maps and give everybody in the neighborhood a copy of this atlas that we were going to make. Well, that isn't quite what happened, but we did start making this atlas. And there's a copy of it sitting on the desk out front. It came out in 2010, so 30 years after we'd started this project. No, almost 40 years after we started this project. This map was made in 1982, and it was a terrific struggle to get made. And that's why I keep bringing it up, because this was the first map that we managed to make in which the students were enabled to think about the neighborhood without the goddamn streets. You know, they just wanted to put the streets on the paper, and then they'd put things on the streets. So this is a map of streetlights, and it's called Pools of Light. And that's what they wanted to do. You know, take a map of the neighborhood, sidewalks and so forth, and there are these little dots on it where the streetlights are. And I was like, why do we have to have the streets on the map of the light at night? You know, anyhow, it took a long time, but we finally got the streets off the map. At that point, they were black circles on a white background. So then the question was, why, if we're showing light at night, do we have to have a white background with black where the lights are? Oh my God, how stupid. So they were white circles. And finally, we got a pochoir brush, and around the center of each one of those, which is an actual location of a street lamp in Boylan Heights, Raleigh, North Carolina, we got some suggestion of the sense of the way the light coming down through the leaves of the trees, or just the branches of the trees in the winter, you know, this sort of fractures the light and turns it into this interesting, anyhow, that's Boylan Heights at night, from the point of view of the lights. And after we made that map, there was no turning back.
Thank you very much. So the last, but not least on our panel, is Javier.
Okay, Xavier, I work with Leonor under the name of Bureau d'études. We make some maps since 25 years. In the beginning, it was more to try to see in which world we are, because it's difficult to see this world with photography or camera. And it was also how we can make some maps about capitalism and the state, because when we speak about the state, then it's quite difficult to see that. It was also in the beginning to map the question of the enemy, how we can map the question of our enemy. And after that, we think there is a problem, because in this map it's about the French state, and there is a question of how we can act in a system we have a part of. And that is a map of a system, and we are a part of that. We make this map with the idea to meet the different people, and we are also a part of that. We are represented on this map. And after a time, we think, okay, you have this system, but maybe there is a problem with this representation, because it's a representation from the point of view of the state. And we decide to change the way to make mapping. Alors, that is two questions. You have the question of mapping, but the other aspect, mapping is a representation, but a map is also a scale 1. When you diffuse map, you make a scale 1 mapping, because you connect with other people, and you try to change a social or a social territory. And after this mapping, we decide to move from the city to the countryside to try to make a scale 1 mapping, to work with other people and to build in another way the territory, and to see the question of mapping as relationships between people and how we can move the different actors of this territory. Yes.
Thank you very much. Maybe I would like to ask all of you to elaborate a little bit more on with what you ended your presentation, or your point, how mapping is a tool to engage with other people, how participatory practices form your mapping, and how maps are or are not an extremely good tool to engage in collective and collaborative work, and maybe why they are not good for something else. So, would you like to start?
So, hello. Oh, there we are. So, I think I said this earlier this afternoon, but I don't think I've ever met a person who, when I said that I was involved with maps, didn't say, "Oh, I love maps." And I think that's the big entree here for me. People love maps. At least they say they love maps. and therefore they're willing to engage in maps. They're willing to look at them, and I think very frequently they're looking for a way to get into it and attack it. It's, oh my God, that house isn't there. It's, but it gets them into the map, and they're looking at the map and they're reading the map, and it really doesn't matter, it turns out, how ordinary the map is. They can be as wild as that streetlight map, or as ordinary as a Google map. They get involved to those maps. So the map turns out to be this mind-boggling way to connect with other people who, have some bearing on the environment.
Well, if the question is on the participation in the map that I present here, the data was collected in a participatory process. And the map was done by the workshop researchers. And it was open on the last day for visitors from the city to come and to contribute from their own family archive some examples. But maybe unlike you, Denis, where I come from, maps are not that legible. It's easier for people to describe than to read the map. Out of 8 out of 10 Uber drivers, for example, will call you and say, "Where do I come? Would you please tell me?" And it's something I think that is in the culture, that our maps are more verbal and more descriptive than being visual. So, for example, in our case, as you see, the map was at the end very unreadable. But I think that the good thing was that all the visitors came, and maybe I didn't explain this clearly. The map is related to a timeline of events. And all the visitors who came, everyone would pick up the string from the time and go back to the geography, or from the geography and go back to the time. And as if they were moving with the maps with their hand to explore it and to see how this time and space meet. So I think even if the process of mapping is not as participatory as possible, but the process of reading is very tangible and human in its way, which, I don't know, think that it's offering a little bit more of how does a user interact with the map, maybe.
I was told that Nico wants to do an announcement. Thank you, Nico and Erin.
Great, hopefully you can hear me now, if you couldn't before, but I hope you could hear everything. Yeah, so when we started as the Anti-Eviction mapping project, we really started because a lot of people in the community were being evicted. But what was really weird was that people were getting eviction notices by these LLCs, these limited liability companies, these shell companies. And nobody really knew who their landlords were or how to protest their evictions because it was hard to figure out who was even evicting them. So our project really began to start to map these corporate landlords, these shell companies, and try to figure out where different points of pressure were that people could organize against. And so we've found, for instance, like in Oakland, there's this one guy who happens to be on the mayor's Office of Housing, who through over I think it's over 500 different shell companies, has evicted over 4,000 buildings since 2008. But nobody would know that because they're using these weird LLCs and shell companies. So what we've been able to do is produce data and maps that kind of link all of these things together to help empower tenants and housing activists to figure out who's actually evicting them so that people can work together and fight back. And we've actually found that quite effective. We've been able to occupy different landlords' offices and stop different evictions that way. So that's kind of the first way we started working with different folks to map and stop evictions. We also realized that the data we were getting from courts and rent boards never said anything about who was getting evicted, so we started collecting our own data or working with different housing clinics and different community partners to analyze clinic data so we could better understand, for instance, in the Bay Area, it's disproportionately people of color that are being evicted in comparison to white tenants, and that we could start having a better anti-racist analysis about what's happening. We also started to understand how different tech companies were connected to real estate speculation and the remapping of space, and who was part of that and implicated, and who was being forced out because of that. So basically, since we began, pretty much every map that we've made with a series of community partners, because we've wanted to make sure that the maps and the data are relevant and that they'll produce more good than harm. When we do oral history mapping, we've made it a priority to anonymize certain data because we don't want to make a map that's gonna somehow implicate somebody or lead to somebody's eviction. So we've been sort of careful about making some of our maps less representational in terms of a sort of normative cartographic Cartesian practice than others. So I don't know. There's a long history of ways that we've worked with people to fight displacement and keep folks in their homes. So, yeah.
But why maps?
Why maps?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, so when we started, we knew people were being evicted, but we didn't know where. You know, if you want to make a protest, you need to know where to show up. If you're being evicted, you might want to know where other people being evicted by your same landlord also live. You might want to know which neighborhoods are being impacted most or which streets are being impacted most. I think placement and displacement are obviously very spatial phenomenon, so maps are useful tools if used right to fight back. And of course, real estate speculators are also using maps to remap neighborhoods and create their own sort of, microhoods, I think they're calling them. Microhoods. So the Mission in San Francisco, which is a historically Latina neighborhood, that's kind of the ground zero of evictions, has been rebranded as the Quad by a real estate speculator trying to encourage people who work in Silicon Valley to live in this neighborhood. So every single day, I think the real estate industry, techno-capitalism, et cetera, are using maps for the sake of capitalism. So we're, of course, trying to use them to fight that and to fight racial dispossession. So, yeah.
Thanks.
I can give two examples. One is the constitution of collective memory, how we create through map a collective memory, and that is very important for struggle, but also for the formation of commons. And that is to go to meet some people and to constitute resources, collective resources of memory. And a second example is more, and now we are in a process for that, is to create a scale 1 mapping. It's a mapping of people in a territory who produce some facts, and that is the first mapping. It's a first mapping, and with that it's possible to produce a representation but also to diffuse. And that is very important, I think, to connect the process to produce the representation, but also to diffuse.
Thanks. My third question would be, and I actually have 4 questions I just saw, would kind of be about the limits of maps. We heard a lot about how great these maps are. We heard that Denis doesn't like maps. And I would like perhaps to start with you. Kind of to elaborate a little bit more on what the limits of mapping and what the pitfalls of mapping, and we heard at one example of the squatted houses outside of Berlin that people don't want to be mapped. So, and I can imagine some issues about housing where people don't want to get mapped, and where it produces a very dangerous knowledge for capital, for example. So,
So yeah, that's a good question. I think there are lots of examples that I can come up with, but when we, for instance, produce oral histories with tenants who are being evicted, we want to, share deep neighborhood histories that kind of defy real estate speculative geographies. We want to share tactics for fighting back, but the last thing we want to do is to lead to somebody's getting targeted by their landlord. And the last thing that we want to do is contribute to gentrification unfolding in particular ways. So there's some knowledge, and there's some people, and there's some stories that we actually don't want to be accessible to the wider world. And I think, of course, we're all about open source when it comes to technology, but I think there's a sort of idea that by making all data open and accessible, it's going to somehow make the world a better place. It's actually, when it comes to sensitive eviction data, that's not the case, right? There's some data we don't want to get into the hands of certain real estate agents or speculators or lawyers. There's some people who we want to make sure they can protect their anonymity as they share their stories. So I think that it's really important to kind of think, does a map make sense? Does it make sense to give this point of data, or this shape of data, or this temporality of data, a geolocation that somebody else might be able to use to do a particular form of harm? And I think that there is, especially with this sort of, techno web mapping accessibility now, there's this idea that everybody can produce maps of everything, and somehow that's going to be cool or interesting. It's really easy to produce a web map using a handful of proprietary software, but the companies that produce that software might be making money with that software that's doing something somewhere else. So I think that it's really important to kind of think, does it make sense to make a map? Who's benefiting from this? Is it just I'm going to become cool because I make a map because maps are cool? And I think sometimes it doesn't make sense to make a map, or it doesn't make sense to make a map in a certain way. And in that case, what's another way that we can share that story or that piece of information that's not going to do any harm? And I don't know. That's what I have to say. But, yeah.
Thanks. Does anyone of you want to add to that?
I think in the case of the map of Port-Said, for example, one of the main limitations is what the power structure you're operating under allows you. The whole map was taken over, and the whole place, it was a kind of a community center. It was closed in one of the crashes on the civil community in Egypt. So you can make a map, you can do and so, but under which conditions, and who is seeing this map as well, and who's being threatened by it, and how far they can block a specific narrative. So I think the limits of the map are the limits of our being as well, right? Or our free speech and ability to be present and represented.
The problem with maps for me is that they have this inclination to suggest that they know what the deal is, and they don't. They never do. I don't care how goddamn accurate they are. They're always missing most of the story. And even the part of the story they're showing, they don't usually get right. So what I really, 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 really don't like about maps is the way they stand up and say, I'm right. And that's just bullshit, to be frank. So for me, the limitations of the maps are the limitations, I guess, of speech as well. The ability to insist. But maps have a way of insisting through the way they are that they're specially right. They're not just right like a kid can say, I know I'm right. No, they're really right. And they just wear that and emblazon that, and I think that's so false. And So that's why I don't like maps in the beginning, because they just say, you're wrong, I'm right. And that's not right.
About the limit of the map as a tool, I think the difficult question is to find the strategic point for the efficiency of action. And it's not so easy to find that, but in a way it's before mapping. It's when we do on a map, we do that for the constitution of commons and also for the constitution of a collective and for collective consciousness about the territory. But after you have also, okay, how we can use that and where, in which place, for example, in which place, but where in the social organization we can act. And that is not so easy to find through mapping.
Mm. Okay. My last question before we are going to open the discussion to the audience would be, because I don't want to end on such a negative feeling that maps are inherently limited, or that the situation is so dire that there's no point in mapping, we're going to lose anyway. I would like to ask you about what kind of inspirations you get from maps, and what kind of map you really would like to do if you had the resources and the time. And would you like to start?
Yes. There are different meanings of your question. The first is which kind of map we have in project. And one is we work on a map about the way it's a cosmic capitalism. It's how we can map the action of capitalism on the moon. That is a project. And another project of mapping, it's about the nature capital, how all the elements of the reality become a factor of production. Yes, that is two projects for the moment. But after we work also on a game, because we think that a game is also a way to create a multi-perspectivist approach of the map with where you can have the conflictuality inside and to think about a dynamic mapping with different point of view.
I'm very inspired by so many of the maps that are here, and I haven't actually sat down with the atlas and read it cover to cover, but I'm sure I'll be even more inspired by more maps when I do that. I think well, one of the things that we're doing right now with the mapping project is actually producing an atlas, which is a lot harder than I ever imagined that it would be. So I have a lot of respect for this book. But one of the things in producing this atlas that we're doing is really trying to kind of decenter normative ways of thinking about gentrification and to bring in other analytics and tools that we can use. So we're challenging ourselves and building new community partnerships in producing this atlas. And so, for instance, we have a chapter on indigenous geographies and colonial histories, trying to think about how those inform, how settler colonialism informs contemporary conditions of gentrification in San Francisco and Oakland. And we have a chapter on environmental racism and public housing, like a chapter on migration and relocation. So we're trying to think a little bit more broadly about what displacement means. So I'm excited about that, and I'm excited about the new partners that we're working with to produce those. And yeah, and I'm also just excited about tools that are accessible and useful and that are actually doing some important work in the world. So right now we have a tool, for instance, where you can look up an address and figure out if there was ever an eviction there, and then pledge to boycott renting or buying that unit. And we're trying to make that more expansive and make that connect with some other data, so that we can actually like boycott real estate speculators and evictors. And one of the things I learned that I didn't know, but was the word boycott comes from well, like the late 1800s in Ireland, when there was this colonial slumlord in Ireland, and the tenants who lived in his building decided they were going to stop paying him rent, and his name was Sir Charles Boycott, so that's where we get the word boycott. So I'm inspired by that, to think about how we can sort of start to better boycott people who profit off of dispossession. So yeah.
Great, thanks.
Would I sound so pessimistic if I said I don't aspire to make maps?
It would, yes.
But I made maps because back then, when I was working on this research project, they meant to me a lot. They were my outlet way. They were the way that was more convenient to represent what I wanted to say, the complexity of memory, the relationship between memory and space. But I'm no longer working on this research project now, and I wonder what would be my next representational thing. Maybe photography or video or I don't know, drawing or.
Thanks. Dennis.
Yeah, I don't have any desire to make a map. I mean, I don't know how I ended up in this thing in the first place, but no. The only map I can imagine really wanting to make would be a map of a world in which all of these problems were solved. Capitalism had been banished and defeated. People were no longer being evicted, etc. That would be a map worth making. But, that's not going to happen. Sorry to say.
Okay, that was not the final round I was expecting and hoping for. So I hope some of you have questions or kind of positive notes to give us before we all can go to the bar. But we have time for a round of questions and comments, and I hope someone will ask. And I have a microphone.
You already answered it a bit, and I asked myself how you can avoid that all the critical maps are used for wrong purposes, which is very easy, I think, even with a radical Kreuzberg map. For example, some whatever real estate companies could use it to see, maybe we should better invest in that area rather than here, and stuff like that. Yeah.
It's true. Boylan Heights, and I'm not saying this is because of making this atlas, but I couldn't afford to move in there anymore. I mean, good God, the housing values have just zoomed up through the sky, and no, you have to. Not only that, it's become sort of Republican, and no, I wouldn't even want to live in Boylan Heights any longer. I think the mapping activities did have something to do with that, and I really regret that. The atlas too, gave the neighborhood, because the atlas became a big deal, and Boylan Heights had nothing to do with it at that point. I mean, I'd done that atlas in the early 80s, and the atlas came out in 2010, and yeah, everybody bought a copy of the atlas, and they talked about it, and they showed it up. No, it's terrible. It's a horrible thing to happen. Man, this is all downer talk, isn't it? But yeah, I guess that's it about maps. They have a horrible potential to do terrible, terrible things. Well, I mean, come on, this whole world situation that we're in is due to maps. And maps create the nation state, and the nation state loves maps, and so do all jurisdictional areas. You know, that's how they create their boundaries and defend their boundaries. Maps are really, really horrible instruments.
Please buy our atlas.
I mean, they really are horrible instruments, and death to the map.
Anyone else? Please. So critical mapping as preparing the ground for capital, that's a sad story. Anyone else? If there are no questions and everybody's depressed, I was...
I know, Aaron, that you are also, so you are mostly working with digital maps, but then I know that you are also like, then going back into like the city and producing murals, if I got it right, yeah. So I would be interested if you could explain a bit more on this method, or how, yeah, what you are doing and what thoughts are behind this, like going with the digital map back into the city.
Yeah, thanks. Well, it's kind of funny because the mapping project began when like 4 housing activists who had never made a map in their life sat down in the tenants union and decided to make a map. So we were always kind of rooted in the kind of activist analog world, and then decided to like dork out on mapping for a little bit. But right after we made our very first map, for instance, which was a map of one type of eviction in San Francisco that is used primarily by real estate speculators, we created a stencil that said tenants here forced out, and just started to give the stencil to people in different community meetings. And before we knew it, people had started stenciling the sidewalks outside of buildings where there had been evictions to kind of show what we showed in our map, which was where these evictions were, but to put that in the analog form. And we were inspired that that was happening, so then we decided to, well, we started an oral history project where we started recording stories of people who had been evicted, and geolocating those, sometimes anonymously, sometimes not, on an online web map. But then we decided to create a mural form of that in an alley in San Francisco that is known for political murals, but that also happens to be perpendicular to like the most, I think, gentrified street in all of San Francisco, and also happens to be right across from the police station. Maybe these things are connected. So we created our oral history mural, which featured different stories in our online map. And there's this call the wall function where you can call a phone number and hear those stories. And we included the story of somebody, Alex Nieto, who the police have murdered and killed in cold blood in San Francisco after like a few different gentrifiers racially profiled him as dangerous, and then the police came and killed him, which is a thing that happens all the time in the US, probably you know. So anyway, so we created this mural, but then when we decided to dedicate the mural, we brought the Justice for Alex Nieto Coalition together and other tenants who were featured in the mural to bring people in real space and real time together and have a pretty somber dedication ceremony, which then somehow turned into a march, and then somehow turned into some dance party at a local taqueria. So I think that's really important for us. Like, we don't want to just create web maps. A lot of people who we work with, who are like our family, friends, neighbors, et cetera, don't really value the internet as much as others. So we want to make sure that stuff is accessible in multiple formats and genres and spaces and temporalities. And yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to ask to all of you how you make sure that the maps you're producing are accessible for a lot of people, because I think that's also like a question. You can have maps maybe on the computer, a digital map. You can have a map printed out. A lot of people have maps on their smartphone. So if you don't have a smartphone, if you don't have this technology or computer, how you make it accessible that it can be also useful for a lot of people. A lot of people can use it, not only, you know, some whatever academics or whatever who know about it.
Well, one thing you can do is you can publish them in as many different, ways that you can. My atlas was published in thousands of copies, 2 different editions, so it's gotten out there, and it's been publicized by a lot of strange outlets like Ira Glass, who runs a very popular radio show in the United States. Man, that was a really strange thing, in fact, now I think about it. He interviewed me about maps on background, because I'd written The Power of Maps and other map books, and he just wanted to he was going to do a map show on the 5 senses, mapping sight, sound, touch, etc. And so I had an hour with him just talking about maps and laying out the sort of history and their involvement with the state and so forth. And at the end of the hour, he says, well, do you make maps yourself? And I said, not really. I'm really sort of a critic of cartography. But I have been working on this atlas of my neighborhood for 20 years. And he was, oh, we need another hour in the studio. So we did another hour, and this was all about this Boylan Heights mapping project, which, I'd put in 1986, we started this atlas in 1982. In 1986, I put all the things we'd accumulated in boxes, and I stuck the boxes in the back of the closet, because that was a dead project. And here's this guy saying, well, and you know what else I need? We're going to put this on the web, and I need at least 6 of your maps so we can show them. And one of the maps I talked about is the one on the cover of that book, the pumpkin map. I'd never actually put it together. I'd photographed all of the pumpkins one Halloween. I photographed all the pumpkins on the porches in Boylan Heights. And I'd written down their addresses so I knew where they were, and I had the images, but I'd never, mapped it. I'd never put it on a map, so I had to make that map for this Ira Glass web thing. And that just kicked the whole thing. I thought, oh my God, look at this magic stuff that's on the web now. I didn't even know any of that had happened. I was like, wow, I'll bet I could finish this atlas in no time. I could do it myself, because originally it had been done with quite an incredible group of students, and we'd worked on it for 6 semesters. Anyhow, that's how that all unfolded. Why am I telling you this story?
I have no idea.
I completely forget what was the question?
I have no idea, but I'm very thankful that you talked about talking about maps and doing maps, and to bring us a little bit closer to an optimistic end of the evening.
Well, maps are fun to make. I mean, there's no question about that, and I certainly get a kick out of it. But I grew up on playgrounds, and I love playgrounds. But I recognized that playgrounds were a tool that the automobile culture had invented to keep kids off the streets. We do not need a culture that has playgrounds. We need a culture that has no cars. And I mean, it's that simple. And it's the same thing with maps. Okay, the fact of the matter is, I do love maps, But they're evil things, This is a horrible conflict. It's like, I think it's like being human, but...
Okay, thank you very much. I do not see any hands, so I would like to thank our panelists. I would like to thank you, and I would like to ask Severin to say some final words.
Okay. Yeah, thank you as well. Come on, Drew. Come. Paul, we are ending this right now.
So another important part of being human, if I can take that point up from Denis, is of course making party, right? So we will have a party here. We'll start smoothly, I'd say. So we still have the exhibition. We put some music and then put it louder and ever louder. But first of all, before we can start somehow a party, we need to get rid of these chairs.
Somehow, this is, there we go. I remember the question now. The question was, how do you publish? Well, I don't remember it. She told me. And the fact of the matter is, you need to get those maps out in as many possible ways as you can. Print, web, poster, a billboard, an atlas. Yes, buy an atlas. You need to get them out in as many possible ways as you can. So that's the answer to the question, I guess. Okay, go on.
Get the chairs out of here.